Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. With 3 weeks before U.S. President Barack Obama will leave office to allow for President-elect Donald Trump to assume his role, we will review the 8-year administration and evaluate the impact it is expected to leave behind in the Middle East in general and Israel in particular. To do so, I'm joined here in the studio by Ambassador Alan Baker, a director at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Efraim Inbar, the founding director of the BESA Center, the Begin Sadat Center at Bar-Ilan University. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Oren, give us a little bit of understanding. How did things start, and we'll go from there.
You know the age-old debate about the role that a person, a single individual, can have in society and in world affairs, whether the man has an impact on the circumstances or vice versa. Obviously, Barack Obama did not have such a big impact on circumstances, but rather he was shaped by circumstances. I happen to have accompanied President Obama almost 7.5 years ago on his first trip to Europe, when he went to the Strasbourg NATO summit. Then he went on to Prague. And he was naive, obviously. He spoke about the end of the nuclear era, and then he went on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize as an advance, which he is yet to give back. And obviously, he is leaving office not only grayer and more tired, but with not a lot to show for it. However, we should also admit that when we are now summing up his period, we are doing it knowing full well that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton, and therefore his whole legacy, the whole Obama legacy, is going to be clouded by the knowledge that his legacy was rejected by the American voters. So perhaps he is worthy of some praise, but this does not seem the best of times to say it.
Ambassador Baker?
I think with respect to naivety, I agree with you. But Obama's, what he's done over the 8-year period, he established a sort of dynamic that caught on among the Europeans and other countries in the world. And it's a dynamic that still exists and will probably continue, that can't necessarily be stopped, whether immediately or over a period of time. I don't think Obama or his colleagues, Kerry, Clinton and others, I don't think they were hostile from the point of view of Israel. I think, like many American leaders, they thought that they know better than Israel or its leaders what Israel should be doing. And so I think they might well have had good intentions, but as was said, there was an element of naivety, a lack of realistic knowledge of what's going on in the area and how the people feel that left the situation as it is now, which is a very liquid situation.
Mm-hmm. Professor Inbar?
I think that Obama will be remembered primarily by the perception of American weakness. President Obama is seen, particularly in the Middle East, but not only in the Middle East, as a person that has no clear foreign policy goals that are rooted in realistic analysis. And unfortunately, many of American allies have questioned American credibility in the past 8 years, and this is a problem for the United States. Having said that, I think we should not exaggerate what the United States can do in the world, or particularly in the Middle East. After all, the main forces at work are the domestic forces, the regional forces, and we should not expect, as the United States, under any president, to fix all problems.
Mr. Oren, of course, 8 years is a long time to try and review and analyze. However, I'd like to start with President Obama's first trip to the Middle East. Obviously, there was the famous speech in Cairo, as well as various meetings in Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The famous bow which President Obama had in front of the King of Saudi Arabia, which brought him a lot of criticism and skepticism with regard to his ability to understand this Middle East, which doesn't operate in that way. But at the same time, the moves that he made, especially by not coming to the State of Israel in his first trip to the Middle East, has signaled both to Israel and the Arab world his interest and rapprochement towards the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization which he has identified as a possible contender for regional power. Give us a little bit of an understanding on that.
Well, it's a bit unfair to single out Obama in a long line of American leaders who had their own American ideas about democracy, about elections, because the previous administration of George W. Bush, with Condoleezza Rice as his Secretary of State, forced Israel to include Hamas in the elections some 11 years ago, January of 2006, on the same premise that the Palestinian community should have free, full, and fair elections, one man, one vote. And if Fatah is corrupt, so let Hamas take over. And obviously, and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood are one of and the same. And yes, Obama was also naive regarding what will happen if the Americans ditch Hosni Mubarak after 30 years of being a close ally. They didn't anticipate the revolution. And once the revolution took over and Mohammad Morsi became the president, they fell in love with him and were angry at General Sisi when Morsi was toppled from power. But then again, you have cycles, 8-year cycles. Bill Clinton served 8 years, Bush Jr. served 8 years. And now, after 8 years of Obama, apparently the Americans are tired of this policy. But when Obama took office, he had almost 8 years of involvement in Afghanistan and more than 5 years of involvement in Iraq. He wasn't free to go back to the drawing board and try to implement his own policy. He had to carry on. He even kept Secretary of Defense Robert Gates as a continuation of the latter part of the Bush era. And he didn't have enough stamina to go on with his policy. But as regards Israel, for the first year, he did have some power, or at least the perception of power. And the evidence is that Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed. First of all, had the two-state solution in the Bar Ilan University speech, and then he also agreed to the settlement freeze. There was no follow-up to that. But at the beginning, and looking towards an 8-year presidency, people feared Obama. Then they saw that he is not so fearsome.
Ambassador Baker?
Look, he started with high hopes. He genuinely believed that he will solve the issues of the Middle East, and this we saw in Cairo and in his general comportment that he genuinely felt that, okay, I'm here, I'm probably here for 8 years, I'll solve the issue of the Middle East, and that will be my crowning achievement. And this is part of the naivety. He just didn't grasp the will of the various people in the Middle East and the way of dealing with things. American leaders sometimes think that everybody is like them and everybody is straightforward and honest, and they don't always realize that in the Middle East you have to deal in a different manner with the various the leaders and governments.
Professor Inbar?
I think if I have to single out a basic failure, is the deal with Iran. Because the deal Obama made with Iran legitimized a nuclear infrastructure in Iran. It delayed to some extent the issue. And the most important effect of this deal is plans for nuclear proliferation in countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Turkey. And this is something that he definitely didn't plan to do. He's against nuclear proliferation. Moreover, taking into consideration that he wanted, at the beginning of his presidency, to make good with the Muslim world. The Muslim world is mostly Sunni, and he basically sided with Shiite power, with Iran. And even from his own rationale, this was a terrible mistake.
I beg to differ. I think the Iran Accord was one of his best achievements. It's a good deal for the United States, but also for Israel. If Israel knows how to take care of the 10-year or 15-year interval. The proof of the pudding is in the follow-up, not in what has been signed a year and a half ago. But just to return for a moment to what Ambassador Baker said, in the Middle East, you have a cauldron on the fire all the time, and you have a lid on it. Once you take the lid off, you don't know what you unleash. This is not characteristic of Obama only. This happened when Saddam Hussein was removed for good reasons, but this was the result when Gaddafi was removed in Libya, and also what happened in Egypt when Mubarak was pushed by the lack of American support. So you know the devil in power, you don't know what devils will come instead of him.
Ambassador Baker.
No, I think with respect to Iran, I disagree with you.
I'm in the minority here.
Absolutely. I think that the Iranians made a laughing stock of Kerry and of Obama, and they played them in the way that the Iranians know how to do, and this naivety was so obvious in the way that they allowed themselves to believe that they're achieving something positive. It might well be positive, and I grant you that, but the way that the statements that we're hearing coming out of Iran would appear to indicate exactly the opposite. They consider that they managed to play the President of the United States and the leaders of Europe their own game, and they succeeded.
Well, might be positive elements to it, but obviously it doesn't have a lot of prospect now that both Trump as well as other leaders in the region decided to push ahead and see how they can actually break down this deal. Professor Inbar, how do you see, though, the current situation in the Middle East where you have a perceived vacuum from U.S. power, which was so dominant over so many years, and suddenly so many different players, including Russia, which has reemerged as a regional power in this region, as well as other countries that are trying to bite in this cake of regional chaos. How does this play out?
First of all, I want to emphasize that I do not necessarily favor an active American role in every regional crisis. It's not useful, but what the United States lost, there are two things. First, its credibility, which I mentioned before, and second, also its capability. We should take a look at the military power at the disposal of the United States. The Sixth Fleet doesn't have a permanent carrier. The Seventh Fleet doesn't have a permanent carrier, basically not enabling America to project force when it deems it wise to do so. What we see now, indeed, is not a vacuum. Vacuums are filled by other powers. Of course, Iran, its behavior is very aggressive. It wins. It was successful in bringing in Russia. Russia, for its own reasons, of course, came in. And we see a Russian-Iranian alliance winning all over the Middle East. When Saudi Arabia is in trouble, it has a problem on its house in Yemen. Turkey, to some extent, a Sunni power that has a stake in the Middle East, has been to some extent domesticated by Russia. and its ascendance of Iran. That's what I see.
Mr. Oren?
I'm afraid this discussion suffers from the overrepresentation of experts in the field of national security, foreign policy, and international law, because the most important factor is the domestic one in American politics. And the catchword is quagmire. Ever since Vietnam, all American administrations were afraid of being bogged down in a crisis somewhere with no domestic support, which means that they start responding to a crisis and then they are left with no backing from their domestic audience. And you have elections every 2 years, not only every 4 years, but you have midterms. And they are afraid of having started something and then losing support. So after those years of being in Afghanistan and in Iraq, the American military, as well as the American public, were not for any other adventure. So the idea that there was an alternative, a real alternative to the accord with Iran, which, as was mentioned, was not only an American one, but six-power agreement, there was no alternative. The American military wasn't keen on going to war against Iran, so they couldn't deter Iran. Iran knew full well that the threats are empty. All in all, Obama played his cards very well. He didn't have such good cards.
Ambassador Baker?
Look, I disagree in principle. I think that the way Obama behaved was a reaction to George W. Bush and his more activist, worldwide activist policies. And I think now what's happened is that the vote in favor of Trump is a reaction in the opposite direction. And so I think we're going to see a sort of zigzag from the extremely weak or perceived weak situation that Obama brought America into to an attempt to assert American strength, taking into consideration, of course, the internal issues that are very important and have to be.
By the way, how can we infer that, knowing full well that Hillary Clinton got more in the popular vote, 3 million votes more than Trump, and because of Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin, Trump won, which of course is legitimate, but doesn't mean that the American public rejected Obama and Hillary Clinton.
Well, that's a question that domestic issues may try and resolve. Professor Inbar, your perception on the regional matter?
I think that we cannot be sure that this was the only option, a deal between Obama and Iran. First of all, he had the option of not doing a deal and leave the situation as it was. Iran under sanctions, and this was obviously a possibility. Another possibility was to unleash Israel against Iran. I'm sure there were Israelis, high-ranking Israelis that were ready for such a role. So there are other options that the Americans could have implemented. They decided to make a deal which leaves Iran as a major actor. The deal was not connected in any way or linked in any way to Iranian behavior. And we see a very aggressive Iranian behavior in the region. So even if you make a deal, you could have made a better deal. Although I think that the only deal possible was a deal that Iran was ready to sign. But in principle, there was maybe a different deal. Mm-hmm. And it was not capitalized upon the weakness of the regime, the problems they had there. And we see now in Iran, free of many economic constraints, free to take, to implement its Shiite corridor from Iraq to the Mediterranean via Syria and Lebanon. And this did not, preventing it, that did not necessitate necessarily, insertion of American forces. I think that indeed the Americans should be very judicious in their use of force. for strategic reasons, but also for the domestic reasons that were mentioned by Amir.
Mr. Oren, when we're looking at the Obama era, those 8 years that we're talking about, the perception in the Middle East, doesn't matter in what country you go, is a perception that the United States cannot be trusted. Rather, the American population or leadership perceived their actions as a form of change and strategic value, or the aspiration of leading from behind in order not to get embroiled in another conflict in the region. Still, the perception in the Middle East perceives now the administration in the United States as unreliable, as somebody who stabbed the various regimes in the back and moved towards their arch enemy, the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as other key players in the region. How can now the next administration come and fix those challenges that have been put in place, as well as whether the leading from behind has actually really gotten its course and made the big difference that the United States was seeking for?
What you described may be the popular perception or one perception among several. But rulers in the region know the nuances too. For instance, Jordan was bolstered by the Obama administration as well as by the preceding administration. With Israel, the military and intelligence cooperation has never been better. The relationship between the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli intelligence community and the Department of Defense, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Special Operations Command, and the Central Command, which used to boycott Israel, have never been better. People are meeting constantly, information is shared freely, and if there is a common goal, if the political echelons in both capitals decide on an operation, it will be done smoothly. Now, the next administration, we have to wait and see, because there are some contradictions there. On the one hand, Donald Trump seems to be more militant, but on the other hand, he's cozy with the Russians. Can the two wings of this policy act together, or will they be in the way of each other? Let's wait.
Mr. Ambassador.
Look, I look at things as an international lawyer, and I look specifically at the policies of Obama and his secretaries of state vis-a-vis the peace process, and I'm extremely disappointed, and I think there's been a drastic change. You know, the agreements that we have with the Palestinians place issues like borders and settlements, Jerusalem, on a negotiating table. In other words, these are to be negotiated. And we've seen over the 8-year period, Obama and Clinton and Kerry prejudge negotiating issues by coming out and determining, for instance, that Israel's settlements are illegitimate, something that previous administrations never did. They thought they were an obstacle to peace, but they never came out blatantly claiming that they're illegitimate. Or reference to borders, reference to the 1967 lines or borders that we hear, or that we've been hearing from Obama and Kerry, is something that never happened in previous administrations, because the issue of borders is a negotiating issue, and it was determined to be a negotiating issue by the Security Council in 1967. So I think that the positions taken by the Obama administration have been harmful to Israel, in that they're basically strengthening the Palestinians in saying, well, why do we need to negotiate with the Israelis? Because we've got the Americans and the international community behind us.
Professor Inbar?
I tend to agree with Amir that the relationship between Israel and the United States is a healthy, robust relationship. We should remember that Obama and Netanyahu signed a memorandum of agreement which grants Israel $3.8 billion for 10 years, which is, of course, a serious sum. We had our disagreements over the Palestinian issue, which is a minor issue in my view, and on Iran. And despite those disagreements, which were not hidden, which are not put under the table. The relationship continued to be, and the strategic relationship was as Amir Oren described it. Having said that, some of America's allies are indeed questioning the United States. We just seen the Philippines, leader basically trying to cozy with the Chinese because he doesn't trust Obama. From my own contacts in Asia, some people tell me we have to be on the winning side. Basically insinuating that they are not sure that America is going to be the winning side vis-a-vis China. This is a major issue. The Palestinian issue is a minor issue. We have to take a look at the big picture in the world, and this is where the main failings of Obama's administration are.
Mr. Oren.
When Donald Trump tweets, one of his favorite words, one of his favorite punchlines is sad. And it's sad to see Ambassador Baker and Professor Inbar so disappointed in President Obama, in which they probably didn't have too much hope to begin with. However, it's also sad that we're not summing up President McCain right now after 8 years, because before the election of 2008, John McCain was leaning towards Resolution 242, which means territories for peace and a return to or towards the 1967 borders as a Republican president. So this wasn't in the cards. We will never know because he didn't win. He didn't have a Congress to contend with the Friends of Israel and all the rest. But Obama, all in all, had some continuity in American foreign policy. If you look at it from afar and you leave out the nuances, it wasn't a break with the Bush administration, which wasn't a break with the Clinton administration, and so on and so forth. Perhaps Trump will bring some major radical change.
Last sentence on the matter?
For once, I agree with the...
No, I can't have it. We have to disagree.
Your last sentence on the matter, Professor Inbar?
I think that we have a new president now, and everybody is curious to see what's going to happen. We all know that Trump is a bit unpredictable, and I definitely, as a fellow American, wish him great success.
Expect the unexpected.
Well, indeed. I'd like to thank very much Ambassador Alan Baker for coming here, Mr. Amir Oren, and Professor Efraim Inbar. Thank you so very much. And I'd like to thank our viewers, and we will see you next week. TV7 Israel's mission is to give you, our viewers, truthful information, which in effect will give you a chance to really understand what is happening in Israel and its region. If you're blessed by our programs and believe our mission to be important, we urge you to support us and become a voice for Israel. You can support us by going to our website at tv7israelnews.com. This program was made possible through your donations.